The following presentation was recorded at the 2013 SouthEast LinuxFest in Charlotte, North Carolina. It is licensed under a Creative Commons license. For more information about the SouthEast LinuxFest, visit www.southeastlinuxfest.org. The SouthEast LinuxFest would like to thank the following diamond sponsors in 2013 for helping make these videos possible.
Hey, thanks everybody for coming. I think it's a great conference. I've been having a great time. I've learned tons of stuff because I'm sort of an outworlder. I'm not sure. As of yesterday this time, I had never heard before the word DevOps. Never even heard the word, much less knew what it means. I didn't really understand what it meant until this morning. And so I think most of you guys are kind of maybe involved with DevOps or something. You know exactly what that means. So I'm sort of, I just beamed down here, beamed down to earth, and thought I'd give you a little bit of talk. I also want to start with an apology. I want to apologize for my glowing fruit. My primary desktop really is a Linux system. It's an Ubuntu Linux system. I've been using Linux as my primary desktop since the days of Yggdrasil Linux. Who else here has ever run Yggdrasil Linux? Oh, we do have some old timers here. Yeah, I'm glad to know I'm not the oldest guy in the room. So, yeah, and so I don't normally use Macs or Windows systems, though at my office, because my software has to be cross-platform, I've got, Mac. My big two-head Linux box is where I do all my development work, because my opinion is that there is no better platform in the world for doing development than Linux. But my stuff is cross-platform, though, so I have to test it on Mac and on Windows, and so I have those machines standing by, but I normally only use the Mac to travel, because it was really convenient to buy a nice little thin laptop, and I can't go out and I guess Dell sold laptops with Linux on it at one point, but they were not nice thin little really cool laptops like this. So anyway, that's my apology for that. The title of this talk is Checklists for Better Software. Now, who here, I'm a software developer. I've run a small company, and I'm always looking for ways to make things go better. So who here is interested in your organization of getting 50% fewer defects in your code? 50% better team cohesion. 20% better job satisfaction. Your employees are saying, hey, this is a cool place to work. 3 times reduction in staff turnover, faster release cycles, reduced stress and workload. You can have all of that, and it's really easy to get just by using checklists. And this sounds very mundane and old school, but we're going to talk about this a little bit. And I wanted to tell you briefly how I came to use this. Now, I wrote the SQLite database engine. And I kind of fell into this by accident. I used to do bespoke software, and then one of the projects I was working on, it needed a database. It needed an SQL database engine that didn't require a DBA. It was kind of write direct to disk. Didn't have a server essentially. I needed a serverless SQL database engine for a bespoke project I was doing, and so I wrote SQLite, put it out there on the web, and right beside about 7 or 8 other projects that I had put out there on the web, which collectively got about 10 downloads per year. And I figured that SQLite would be just, another one to the collection, but it really took off and it was a big hit. And this grew, and before long, companies started coming to me and saying, we'd like to pay you to support this. And I'm like, you can make money with open source software? How does this work, really? And it was a journey for me. I didn't really understand how this worked, but I kind of figured it out. But anyway, SQLite got to be really big, and so it kind of runs the world now. There's like 2 billion installed, or over 2 billion. We think it's closer to 3 billion instances of it running right now. It's in your phone. Does anybody here not have a not have a smartphone? Who does not have a smartphone in this room? So every one of you else is running SQLite. This gentleman over here has just pushed a picture of SQLite into his camera. A picture of SQLite into an SQLite database into his camera. So it's in all your cell phones. It stores your bookmarks in Firefox, and It runs everything. It runs everything. It's all over. And so there's billions of these all over the place. And it's become very mission critical for a lot of people. And the thing is, when you have an application and a lot of people are using it, if there's a bug in it and it seg faults or otherwise fails, that's never good. But usually you can just reboot it and it starts working great for you. But the problem with a database engine is that it remembers its mistakes. So it's kind of important that it not make any mistakes to begin with. And so really what we do now, I've got a few people that work for me, and our job is to make sure that SQLite is as top quality as we can get it. And we really work really hard to do that. And there's a lot of ways that you can work on making very reliable software. We try and do aviation grade testing on SQLite. But you've got to start with a good design. And we work really hard at refactoring and making sure everything's really robust and solid. A lot of documentation. We do just enormous amounts of testing on SQLite. And that's a whole nother talk. You've got to get great configuration management. If you're building high reliability software, you've got to know what's going on inside your code. So you've got to be able to really carefully track what everybody's committing. You've got to really know your code. I ended up writing my own configuration management system because the ones that were available didn't really meet my needs. But then the one now at the bottom, and that's the topic of this talk, is checklists. And surprisingly, just having some simple checklists as part of your process can make a huge difference in quality. Now, checklists have kind of a long history. They go way back. Here's an example, for instance, of Moses delivering a checklist of ways for the people to run their lives. But really, checklists as we know them today kind of got started in the 1930s. Boeing, or maybe it was the company that was to become Boeing, I don't know if it was Boeing at this time or not, was working on this new airplane for the Army Air Corps called the B-17. And it was the most complicated airplane of its day. And they were doing a test flight, and it was out of somewhere, and there were a bunch of generals. They were just about to order a bazillion of these planes, and they were doing a test flight, and they had a pilot in there, and they were taking it off, and the plane took off, and it went up, and it went up, and it went up, and it went up, and stalled, and went into the ground. Boom. So just about ended the B-17 right there, because this was kind of the demo flight. And what they found was that the pilot, it was so busy worrying about all the engine controls and all of this other stuff, had failed to disconnect the elevator gust lock. Now, the elevator is the flap on the back that makes the nose pitch up and down. And so he took off and was going up, and he tried to push the yoke forward to level off, but the gust lock was in place, and it was locked in place. He couldn't do it. And they were trying to get the gust lock disengaged when it stalled, and it crashed. And so there was an analysis of this, and they said, and some people were saying, this airplane is just too complicated to fly. It's just too much to remember. But they came up with the idea of a checklist. And this has become, and this became a very powerful tool. You can just go down the checklist and make sure everything is set for takeoff, everything's set for engine start, everything's set for cruise, whatever. And this became sort of the standard way of flying airplanes. A modern jet cockpit is run by checklists. Talk to any commercial pilot, everything is by the checklist. And as a consequence, you think about it, aviation is an unbelievably dangerous thing. You're flying through the air so fast, 400 miles an hour, and this thing with just paper-thin skin. I mean, if anything goes the least little bit wrong, you're dead. But they have this incredible safety record. And a lot of that has to do with the intense focus on checklists, or intense focus on safety, and a lot of that has to do with checklists. So, and you might be thinking, well, I'm smart, I don't need a checklist. Well, the checklists are actually designed for smart people. Here's the quote. Using checklists takes the mental load off of flying. You can spend more effort executing the steps of the checklist if you don't have to spend time trying to remember them. Okay? Every one of us in this room has a finite number of brain cycles. Okay? The more time you spend trying to remember what to do next is the less time you have available to spend actually doing it. So checklists are designed to free you up to focus on what really matters. So a checklist is not a crutch for the weak-minded. It is a lever to amplify and focus brain power for the things that really matter. Here's another example from a paper, from the newspaper the other day, well, a couple of years ago. To err is human, but in the aviation environment it's so unforgiving. It's exactly why it's so important to follow procedures, use checklists, and always ensure you have a safety margin to offset the potential for human error. Key point about checklists. You cannot use a checklist to fix incompetence, okay? You've got to know what you're doing before you put the checklist in place. Checklist is not going to change that. The checklist is merely as a guide to help you along. You need to have a good checklist. A bad checklist is worse than no checklist at all. Bottom line. So if you've tried checklists before and they haven't worked out for you, it could be because you had bad ones. So a bad checklist is verbose, it's vague and imprecise. Here's another thing. A bad checklist is imposed by management upon the underlings. You know, people have to buy into this. They have to really believe that this is helping them or that it's not going to work out for them. A checklist is just hitting the high points. It's not an instruction manual. Now, you probably have an instruction manual, which is a separate little book over on the side, so if there's any question about what to do, you do that. But the checklist is just sort of the outline. It's sort of the title page. Users don't like it. It attempts to turn people into mindless robots. That's not the point. The checklist is to focus you and engage you and to make you more productive. And checklists that are untested, if it has not been tested, it does not work. Here's the points of a good checklist that you should be looking for. Precise, succinct, efficient, hits the most critical steps, written by the end users. The people who are using the checklist should be involved in writing it. It encourages teamwork and discipline, continuously refined. If you've written a checklist 5 years ago and you're still using that same checklist, there's something wrong. You're constantly changing your checklists. Here's an example of a checklist that was shown to work really well. This is a surgical safety checklist from the World Health Organization. I got this out of this book by this physician whose name I will not attempt to pronounce. And it's a really good book, and I encourage you to read it. But they put in this surgical checklist, and what happened here was, this is for an operating room. They go in to do a procedure, and they just had this simple checklist, and by putting this checklist in place, they found that they got 37% fewer complications, 47% fewer fatalities out of their surgery. Unbelievable. If you were a drug company and you came out with a new drug that reduced fatalities in surgery by 47%, would that not be all over the headlines of every paper in the world? That's huge. That's unbelievable. But that is what actually happened. They measured this result in this study, and this is now being used more and more. Sadly, it is not universally used. A lot of hospitals still haven't really clued into this idea of quality. But for those that do use it, it works out really well. Now, there's two different types of entries on a checklist, and you need to be very aware of this. First, of course, is the critical steps just stuff that you can't overlook. Has the patient confirmed identity, site, procedure, and consent? In other words, are you working on the right patient? Are you doing the correct procedure? Are we sure it's the left leg we're supposed to amputate and not the right? You don't want to mess this up. And so just a few simple checks like that. And that's kind of obvious. Everybody kind of understands that part of the checklist. This other part, people don't seem to see so much, is designed to encourage teamwork. And I want to spend a little bit of time on it. They've got this step here called confirm all team members have introduced themselves by name and role. So you're in a surgery, and you've got the surgeon, you've got an anesthesiologist, you've got a circulating nurse, you've got a scrub nurse, maybe some others. And what they found is that, you might ask, well, what are these people introducing themselves and going around, tell me your name, tell me your name. How does this help with surgery? Well, they found that it really encourages teamwork, so that if there are complications in the surgery and the patient starts to deteriorate, because they've broken the ice, because they're communicating, they're able to work together much more effectively to salvage the situation. Or even if there's not an emergency, just the fact of introducing themselves and getting people talking to each other makes an enormous difference in the outcome. Yes, ma'am?
Is this introducing themselves to the other team members or to the patient?
To the other team members. Introducing themselves to each other. Because in a large hospital, you go into a surgery and you're the surgeon and you just got a team there that's been assigned. You don't know who the scrub nurse is. Never met this person before in your life. Or maybe you've worked with them before, you've seen them in several other surgeries, but you still don't know their name.
And she's wearing a mask.
And they're wearing a mask at that, yes. So, so this is an important point. To illustrate this, I'm going to, I didn't even try and link in the video. This is a really cool video. You can go on YouTube and get the video of the Apollo 8 launch. I am old enough to actually remember seeing this live. One of the few people here who have seen the Apollo 8 live, okay? I remember this, it was really cool. I was a little kid, and this was the coolest thing in the world. But here's a little bit of dialogue. You can go on YouTube and look at this. Here's a little bit of the dialogue that's going place. A flight is flight controller, and he says, this is about 2 minutes in. They're getting ready. The first stage is about to burn out. They've been pumping kerosene and liquid oxygen out the back of this thing through an 18-inch pipe as fast as they can. And they're about to burn all that out, and they're going to drop the first stage and ignite the second stage. And so the staging status booster, go flight, Fido's the flight dynamics officer, go flight, guidance, flight, guidance, go flight, staging status, we're go for staging, Capcom's the dude that talks up to the astronauts, and Capcom says, Apollo 8 Houston, you are go for staging. Now, this is really cool. It's kind of that, the Tom Hanks Apollo 13 moment. It's a really cool little thing. But think about what's going on here. Okay, they're flying through the air 40 miles above the Earth at about Mach 8. And they're asking, well, can we stage? And the staging is completely automatic. It's not like the astronauts have to push a button or anything. It just happens. And really, there's only two outcomes here. Either the booster stages as it's supposed to, or all of the astronauts die. Okay, those are really only the two possibilities here. So why are they spending all of this effort to go around and poll all of the key people to see if we're go for staging? I mean, what is that about? And it really, of course, I'm not privy. I wasn't part of this team. I was, 7 years old at the time. But I really believe that the point of this is to get the teamwork, get everybody talking, so that if something does go wrong, they're able to deal with it quickly and effectively. Is to keep the communication channels open. Here's a picture of a conductor of a symphony. You can't really see it so well. Trust me, that's the conductor of a symphony. Let's think about this a little bit. If you're managing a bunch of computer programmers, this is something like being the conductor of a symphony, because you've got a lot of high talent people who think they are the best program in the world, each one of them, and you have to somehow corral their egos and make them play together. You have to, all of these musicians here in this symphony could easily be a soloist, but somehow the conductor has to make them sound like a single unit, a single organism. I mean, because, you think, because naively you think, why is the conductor even there? He's just waving his arms. He's not even making noise. How can he contribute to the sound? But he keeps everything going together. And that's sort of the point of the checklist. So I've got some example checklists here. I think I'm probably running way ahead of time. Who has a time? Let me pull my...
153.
Yours is blank, sir. Thank you, 153. I'm way ahead of time. So if you want to jump in here with questions at any point, please do. Here's some example checklists. Now, I'm just really awful at trying to run a business. Anybody here ever tried to run a small business? I read somewhere, I think it was just this morning, that it ought to be a requirement for all politicians that they've at least attempted to start a small business. But it's really hard. There's a bazillion things that you have to know. There's filings for local, state, county, federal government, lots of different agencies in each one of these. They don't tell you that you have to file with them, but if you miss it, they will tell you about the fines you have to pay. It's really complicated, and so a checklist of all that you have to do is a very important thing for starting a business. What to look for in new hires. I'm really bad about hiring people. I just, I look for talent most of all, but it's also good that they're honest and that they get along well with other people. Those are just bonus points. But if you're running a big organization, hiring people is a real problem. And so maybe there's a checklist for that. These are things that I just found on the internet, a negotiation checklist. Now, here's some of the, but we're here talking about software development. Here's some of the checklists that can come out of software development. A checklist for when you make a commit or check in a change. Prior to doing your commit, there's a checklist. And I've got a couple of these that I'll show you that we use in SQLite development. A unit testing and release testing checklist, a bug response checklist. When you want to put in a new feature, what's the checklist? Design rules is not really a checklist, but it helps to write this down. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Who does peer review? Who are developers here versus or who was a developer? If you were a developer, you can say that. Now, versus who does peer reviews? Who has to do a peer review? You've got a peer review process. Do you have a checklist that you use for this, or just sort of? No, but it would be really helpful if you did. This is the checklist that we have for SQLite. We use the Fossil configuration management system. So we do, you do a diff of what you're about to check in with what you're about to check it into, and make sure that you haven't left in any debugging printfs or put in some comments that you shouldn't have put in or something like that. The Fossil extra command looks for unmanaged files in your working directory, because sometimes you'll add a new file and you'll forget to tell it to manage it, and then you do the commit, and then somebody else tries to pull it out, and then it's busted. Make sure that you're checking into the branch that you intend to be checking into, and not to like the production trunk. Here's one. This is a thing. We had a problem at one point where in Fossil it timestamps every check-in, and so here's a case where Dan, his system clock got off. And so we had this, we were both checking into the same branch there, but we have this time warp that's happening because his system clock was 8 hours ahead or something. I think he had it set to, he's doing this out of East Asia, and he had it set to Greenwich time or something. Whatever, he had his system clock on, and it had this really kind of, and that there's no harm with that. It doesn't really hurt the code, but it makes it hard to track. And so we added this bullet to the checklist to say, make sure that your system time is correct. The auto sync would do that for him automatically. But if you're off network, just at least double check and make sure that your timestamp is right. Make sure that make files are updated if you're adding and removing files. And if you're going into the trunk, you've got to pass the test suites with no compiler warnings. So Fossil is the configuration management system that we used for, that we wrote specifically for SQLite to handle some of the things that we needed to do there that other systems weren't doing. And it's become a project unto its own, so I kind of manage two projects. And Fossil is self-hosting, and this is the pre-check-in checklist for it, which is very similar. But it's available online. You've got the URL there if you want to go look at our checklist. And what's interesting there is that if you go, I've got just a key points about this checklist. It's designed to fit on a 3x5 note card. So the idea is that the developers that are working on this, they've got a note card there, and just before you go to type in the command to commit it to do your check-in, you pull up the card, you go down the list just to make sure that you're not forgetting something. It only takes a few seconds, And that's the key point. It's non-intrusive. There's low overhead. It's low ceremony. You're just going over the card really quick to make sure you haven't forgotten anything. And all of these fit on a big card. Now, on this one, if you go to the website, after I've got the little bullets of what you need to check for, there's a big long description that details all of this stuff. So if you're new to the project and what do you mean by no stray changes? Well, then we've got this lengthy description of what that means, what you're actually checking to. But on your 3x5 note card that you're checking, that you're looking at, it just says no stray changes, and that's enough to jog your memory. Oh yeah, I'm supposed to check and make sure that I didn't leave in that debugging comment or that debugging puts. Here's an example of a thing we do for a release of SQLite. We have the status board, which is this great big checklist, and it shows all the tests that we run. And this is an interactive thing, and I'm actually going to demonstrate this for you. Well, I'll talk about it a little bit first, is that we have literally hundreds of tests that we run. And people talk, oh, you ought to automate all these tests. Every one of these bullets is a big automated test suite, okay? So some of these run for hours and hours by themselves, but we still have them individually enumerated and we run them manually step by step, because what we found is that when you have a human in the loop, you'll sometimes spot things that your automated checker won't see. So a lot of times we'll run one of these tests and it'll come back and say, yes, everything passed. But in looking at the output, we'll say, you know, that doesn't look right. And we'll dig further and we'll actually find problems even though the test technically passed. So test automation is a really good thing, don't get me wrong. I mean, some of our test cases here run tens of millions of individual tests by themselves, unintended. But we still want a human to kind of evaluate things from time to time. And so we have this big checklist that we go through. It takes a couple of days. And we have multiple people working on it. And so here's an example of what it might look like. And people would come along and, well, let's see if I can. It's a rather lengthy list where we have lots of different things that we're checking. And suppose I wanted to run, suppose I want to start running this, I could just click on this and say, okay, mark that as pending. And that put my login, DRH, over there, and it knows that I'm running that test. And that particular test takes about an hour to run. So it's running on my system. And that way, Dan, who's, you know, over in Asia, and Joe, who's over on the West Coast, and Mike, who's in Texas, they know that I'm running that test, and they're not going to run it too. It's sort of, you know, checking it off. And then later on, I come along and, oh, there was an error in that test. So I'm going to change that to fail, and I'll, you know, describe what the error is. And then everybody will see that and say, oh, what's this about? And we'll talk about it and fix the problem. And then later on, we can come back and say, okay, that's working now. And then when the whole thing goes green, we know that we're ready to release. And I have a little thing over here which shows the complete history of the number of transactions. This is a really, really goofy, really, really simple kind of web interface. I've never released this because I'm embarrassed by how silly and stupid it is, and it doesn't have a lot of flash and polish. But it's great, but it works well for us internally. It's an internal only thing, and it allows us to monitor and keep track of our testing process. And then when we get to when the entire checklist goes green, that means we're ready to release. We have a bug response checklist. You always have to have a ticket for a bug. You always bisect and identify which releases were impacted by the bug. Notify key customers. I say our business model, because SQLite is completely open source, and a lot of people use it and never pay us anything, but some of our users, they just really want somebody behind it supporting it, and so they pay us an annual fee, and it gives them the right to lots of consultation and stuff, which they never use. But they just, you know, having somebody there to back them up is very important to them. And we kind of know what people are doing with it, and if we see a bug in an area that might impact people, we'll send them an email and say, hey, make sure this is not going to impact your operation. We add test cases to demonstrate the bug, then we fix the bug, and then we have an all-developer meeting in which we brainstorm and say, can this same type of problem have occurred somewhere else in the code? And how can we change our procedures? How could we have caught this sooner if our procedures had been different? And usually that involves maybe adding some new tests or maybe changing a checklist somewhere. We'll always do this with every bug that comes out. New feature checklist. It's just we've got a long list of things that we go through before we'll add a new feature that we have to check. Here at this conference, two years ago, well, it was not like in this building, it was in Spartanburg. One of the keynotes was Spot Calloway, and it was a funny keynote. Who was here for that? Anybody remember that? A couple people were here. That was a great talk. I love that one. He had some very disparaging things to say about SQLite, but we won't go there. But he gave he had his free and open source software fail checklist. And he went down and he assigned fail points. I've actually translated this, and if you follow the URL at the bottom, you can get a translation of Spot's fail checklist. But I changed it into a positive sense so that you get points for succeeding rather than for failing. And that was a really, really fun checklist to do. Here's Joel on software. He had a checklist one time for how to know if the company you're looking at is about, the software company you're looking at is in trouble. Do they have source control? Do they know how to build in one step? Do they have a daily build? Do they have a bug database? Hey, why don't you apply this to your company? Any volunteers? How many can check off everyone here? Do you fix bugs before writing new code? Do you have an up-to-date schedule? Do you have a spec? Do programmers have quiet working conditions? Do you use the best tools money can buy? Do you have testers? Do new candidates write code during their interview? And do you do hallway usability testings? And this was just a checklist that he had. It was a big article that went with it. But checklists like this are great in evaluating things. Here came out on the web just a few weeks ago, a checklist for promoting your open source project. Focus on the most of your effort on the project's homepage or README. Check the project's name, doesn't clash with anything else, and is unique enough to find references for your work later. I failed on that point with the Fossil version control system, because if you do a search for Fossil, you get a bazillion hits for things that were not version control systems. Promote your work to and so forth. There's a bunch of points there. So, key point. Here's a checklist that I wrote for you. Here's a checklist that you need to follow for writing checklists for your organization. Here it is. So, 1, be precise. You want clearly identifiable items in your checklist. You want it to be short. Remember, things that happen a lot, it's got to fit on a 3x5 card. Now, for the release checklist, it takes a couple days to go through it, and it's much bigger. But for the things that happen frequently, keep it on a 3x5 note card. The checklist ought to be editable. Wiki is a wonderful platform for checklists. Remember, your checklist is not written in stone. Well, usually not. Here's, with the surgical safety checklist, the checklist itself fits on a single page, and they've got 23 pages of instructions that go with it. Low ceremony. You don't want a lot of. You don't want to. The idea of the checklist is to save you time, not to cost you time. Just be really simple and fast. Get it done, and then move on. It's designed to be useful. The checklist needs to be written by the people who are actually using it, not imposed from above. And remember to encourage collaboration. Final bit of wisdom. This same quote has been repeated by folks throughout history. Eisenhower's version of it is planning is nothing, or plans are nothing, planning is everything. The very process of making a checklist will force you to think about your processes and how you do software, how you develop it. And just going through the exercise of writing some checklists will help you to write better software, even if you never end up using those checklists, or even if the checklists are a failure, because you've spent time thinking about how is it that we go about doing our work. And it will amaze you just because you're using different parts of your brain when you're trying to put into bullet points how it is that you operate your business. Here's a cartoon. Here's hey Carl, can you look at this problem with me? I've been working on this for hours. You see the x variable clearly cannot be less than 0 because y has to be more than 20. Oh wait, no, that's not right. Okay, I've got it now. Thanks, Carl. Who has ever experienced this? Okay. So this is the point. If you write it down, just the exercise of writing it down or telling it to another person will often give you the ability to see the problem in a very clear, in a much clearer light than you could. You've been staring at it for hours, but now suddenly it becomes clear to you. And the process of going through and writing a checklist has this clarifying effect, just as it does in this cartoon. So, just to review the benefits, you get up to 50% fewer defects, which is huge. Your team works your team works much better together. Michael, I'm going to put you on the spot. I was talking to him last night. He was talking about, the biggest problem he sees is people not communicating. Did I get that right? He works with bigger organizations than mine. I mean, you said your magic number for chaos is 12 developers, and I only have 4, so I'm well under that limit. But if you've got more than 12, communication becomes a big deal. You've got to keep everybody talking, got to keep everybody on the same page, and checklists are a big help. It's not a magic, it's not a silver bullet that's going to slay the werewolf, but it'll help. People report 20% greater job satisfaction, 3 times reduction in staff turnover, faster release cycles, reduced stress and workload. So your homework is, who has a wiki for your project that you're working on? Okay, so your homework is to go to that wiki and write checklists to do the things that you do most in the course of working your project. Then use those consistently for a year. Convince your team to use them. Revise them at least once a month for that year. And we'll give you bonus points if you open source your checklists. And you report back to me, and you'll get your grade at Self 2014. Questions, comments, rebuttals? Talk about anything in the world. I will answer. I open the floor now to all questions. They do not have to be about checklists. They do not have to be about software. Yes, sir.
So, as Wikipedia might say, citation needed. Where are your percentage numbers and claims coming from?
The question is, where do the percentage numbers and claims come from? I believe they come out of that book. Yeah, I probably should have done that. Truth and Delivery, I did this talk at OSCON in 2011, so I'm recycling it for y'all. Leftovers, I'm sorry. But it was well received there, and I thought I'd repeat it to a different audience. And so it was. It's 2 years ago that I wrote it, so I think that's where I got that out of that book. Yes. Other questions, comments? Yes, sir. Well, obviously the release checklist has been the most successful for us. That works really, really, really well. And I was staying on people about using the other checklists on a regular basis 2 years ago. As I was preparing for this talk, I realized, you know what, I've gotten a little bit slack, and I need to kind of remind everybody, hey, that we need to be using these checklists. And in particular, where I picked up a few new developers on the Fossil project, and I have not been briefing them as I should. And And that's kind of showing. And I need to get back on this and say, look, this is to help you out. And so as a manager, you do have to spend some time keeping people up, and you have to encourage people, because the natural tendency will be to ignore it. Remember, I had the slide of the plane crash. The pilot, you know, he'd been flying for 20 years, and I only need to, I'd done this flight more time, you know, I'd done this so much. I only need a checklist, and he left off a fuel additive and killed a bunch of people. And so you tend to kind of get slack, and I'm guilty of that. But we definitely use the release checklist all the time, and we are supposed to be using the other ones, though. If you look on my desktop, I don't actually have a 3x5 note card for the check-in checklist, but on the Firefox, you know, you can do the bookmark menu bar. I have the checklist on one of the top level things. I just hit that and it pops up the checklist page, and it's always the latest, and so I can just glance at it real quick. Yes. Other questions, comments, commentary? Yes, sir.
Why did you release SQLite to the public domain?
The question is, why did I release SQLite to the public domain? Well, remember, I did this in 2000, and I put it out there with the other 7 or 8 projects that I'd released this way. Well, actually, the SQLite version 1.0, it used GDBM as its storage engine. Do you know what GDBM is? It's a key value pair. It used that as the storage engine, which is GPL. And it has to statically link against that. And so SQLite 1, therefore, had to be GPL. No options there. GDBM is key value, and it's unordered keys, and that was a real hindrance to doing a relational database. I needed ordered keys. So I just said, well, I looked at Berkeley DB, and that seemed really complicated, so I said, I'll just write my own. And so for SQLite version 2, which came out in 2001, I rewrote it as, I rewrote the storage engine myself, and at that point it was all my code. I thought, well, what license should I use now to get away from the GPL, because it's too restrictive for people? And I thought, well, Berkeley or MIT license, but you know, what's the point of that really? Why don't I just say public domain, you know, and just that way people can do it? And I did not know it at the time. I thought that public domain would be great, but it turns out that public domain is kind of a uniquely British common law concept. It works great in countries whose laws are based on British common law, like the United States. But you get into like France or Germany, where the legal system is kind of based on Napoleonic law, and they do not recognize the public domain. And you cannot release your works to the public domain. It's just against the law. It's just, you can't do that. And so it has created some amount of confusion for international customers, and so that was perhaps a mistake. You know, if put me in a time machine and take me back 12 years, and I'd probably do the 2-clause BSD license. But it is what it is, and we move forward with it. Other questions? Yes, sir, in the back.
One of your checklist items were that it meets your design rules. I don't know if you ever went into that.
Yeah, the design rules. No, I do. For both SQLite and for Fossil, we have a set of design rules, and I've got it. I go for low ceremony, so it's not a great big document. It's a bullet list. Here's the design rules for Fossil. I can probably bring one of these up for you. Let me see if I can do that. I'll have to start up a Fossil instance here. Hold on. Why isn't it taking that? There we go. it's not under design rules, is it? You know what? I'll have to find that for you offline. We do have design rules, and yes, and really, your question points out a problem. Is that ideally, if I were following my own checklists, I would have been able to pop that right up for you. It's just right there at the tip. This whole checklist thing first came to my attention as SQLite was being used in aviation applications, and we needed to start testing it to aviation grade. DO-178B is the name of the specification that we use. If you're familiar with DO-178B, and so they have they don't explicitly mention checklists, but if you read the secondary literature about how to do it, checklists come up a lot, and so we started writing checklists for everything. But we haven't kept that up as well as we should have, and thank you for bringing that omission to my attention, and I will correct it straight away. Yes, sir.
It sort of seems to me that in software we can automate pretty much everything, or a lot of things. There's kind of a tension between automating stuff and putting it in a checklist. So the checklist can kind of seem like you're failing to make things easy enough to do. I mean, there are obviously some things that you can't automate, but maybe you could automate even format string attack prevention. You could have an automated scanner. You could, you could rejigger your language so you can't do it, or something like that. So what's your thoughts on automation?
All right, so I'm going to interpret your question as asking, there seems to be a tension between automation and manually doing this stuff. And you're right, there is. Remember, I was talking about on the release checklist. People are constantly saying, boy, that's a huge checklist. You've got 100 items on there. Why don't you automate that? And we have automated a lot of it because each one of those items is a huge amount of automation. But why don't we just do one more level of automation on top of it and just have a single checklist item that says, we ran the release test and it worked, and that be done with it. And there's a trade-off here, and it's hard to find the right balance, but remember, having a human in the loop helps you to spot things that aren't really part of the checklist. And so the automation, for automated testing, for example, won't necessarily spot all the errors. It just runs its little automation and sees that it got the answer that it expected. Whereas if you've got a human reviewing it, the human will sometimes spot things that you didn't even think to look at before. So there is some tension here. How much should you automate versus how much should you keep the human in the loop? And I'm not claiming that I have the perfect answer. This has worked, about 100 items on the release checklist has worked well for us. If we were to do the testing manually, it would be literally hundreds of millions of items, because each one of those checklist items will run 10 million tests. But keeping it at that level of granularity seems to work pretty well. Does that answer your question at all? A little bit, maybe. Question, Michael? Or?
I've done an awful lot of automation, and until you have that list, you really aren't getting any farther than that ever. I mean, it's not necessarily that you're failing, but it can be the first step.
Yeah, I think you were talking about
Here, come and speak into the microphone.
The checklist is and I definitely agree that having eyes on the problem is always very important, but it's also a genetic piece to automation is getting the list of things that you actually plan to do.
All right, so what you're saying, Michael, is that you can't automate it until you have a checklist to automate.
Basically, I'm not saying you can. I'm saying it's incredibly hard if
Or
you don't. You're going to fail without
yes,
failing.
you're going to fail to automate it well unless you have the checklist first. So that makes sense. So if you want to automate your testing, first do a manual checklist and run it 2 or 3 times and make sure that works. And once you're convinced it works, then automate it. That makes sense to me. The other thing I should point out is that on that release checklist, if you go back, and those are all public. Now, the editing part you can't get to without passwords, okay? But just to see the results, they're always public. And you can go back and look at the sequence of releases that we've done with this, and you can compare, and you'll notice our checklist is different with every release because we learn something new at each release, and we modify our checklist accordingly. And maybe that would be harder to do if it were completely automated, because then we'd have to change your automation, and then you'd have to test your automation, and so there's a balance in there.
There's some things that aren't automatable.
And there are some things that are not automatable, like there were some code review steps on that checklist. And then also some of the tests involve moving cables around on hardware and stuff, and we can't really automate that. And some of them, involve, running tests on an Android phone, and these things are hard to automate unless you've got, lots of hardware dedicated to the task. I don't keep my Android phone plugged into this because I like to use it as a phone too. So, yeah. Yes?
So, do you use any, well, first of all, can Fossil does it have any support for doing code reviews?
Does Fossil have any support for doing code reviews? Not directly, no.
Okay, what do you guys use for that?
We don't do code. I am the code reviewer in chief, and so what happens?
So you just audit every commit?
Yeah, I really do, and Fossil has this cool feature so that if I wanted, I can click on a check-in like that, and then click on another one, and it gives me the diff between those two check-ins. And then I've also got the neat little timeline thing here, which I check constantly, so I know what everybody's committing. And if there's any question in my mind about what they're committing, I check it. And then one of the release checklist items is, I run a diff from the previous release to the new release. And I re-review every single line of code that's changed since the previous release. So we don't have a team review, a peer review type thing. It's a Richard review, a little different, but pardon me? Feature request, yeah, whatever. Okay, you can code. Would you like would you like commit privileges on the Fossil repository? We can work that out right here. Yeah. Questions? Enjoy the rest of the. Oh, wait, another question.
Multi-user version,
Multi-user version of what?
SQLite. Ever?
Well, no. So the question is, will there be a multi-user version of SQLite? That kind of defeats the point of SQLite. I mean, if you want to multi-version, what we say when people come to us and want multi-version users of SQLite, we point them out to the PostgreSQL table. Because really, SQLite was not designed for that. I mean, it's designed for the cell phone is the canonical application for SQLite. How many people are using your cell phone at one time, really?
I was thinking more of a replacement for the Jet engine. Microsoft finally.
A replacement for Jet. Oh, SQLite's a great replacement for Jet. Why do you think you need multi-user for this? What Jet won't hold up to more than one user. Generally not even that. Yeah, Microsoft has embraced SQLite in a big way over the past year, and they're pushing it hard. I mean, SQL Server is still a big product for them, and they're also pushing SQL Server really hard. But whereas before, when people would come to them and say, we want a small little thing, they had scaled down, SQL Server Lite or whatever it was, and they're pulling back from that. They said, no, just get SQLite and use that. So the point of SQLite is it writes directly to the disk. It's not really a replacement for a client-server database engine. It's a replacement for fopen. And that's what it does well. And if you want to go further from that, really get Postgres or SQL Server or whatever you're comfortable with working with. I will say that SQLite, when I sat down to write it, I didn't really understand SQL at that time, and I just went to the Postgres documentation and used that as my implementation guide for SQLite. So, and even today, and during the testing, one of the 3 test suites for SQLite involves testing queries, running them on SQLite, MySQL, Postgres, SQL Server, Oracle, and Informix, and making sure they all get the same answer to the same query. That's important, And during the course of doing that, we've got literally, I think it's over 100 million test cases of that. And we found bugs in every database engine except for Postgres. We're never to get that to fail. Now, I'm told that we just didn't look hard enough. There are, in fact, bugs in Postgres, but that sort of impressed me that Postgres is the only. We seg-faulted Oracle and Informix both, and SQL Server. Seg-faulted every one of them. And at some point or another with bizarre queries that we were feeding it. And, but we were never able to do that with Postgres. And so to this day, if there's ever a dispute about what some query should actually be doing, which comes up about once a week on the SQLite mailing list, I'll bring up Postgres and see what it does, and then I'll go back and say, well, Postgres gets the same answer as SQLite, so go away, you know, I'm gonna go with that. So, yes, ma'am.
So it looks like we have automated testing for SQLite, and how many people work on testing?
Well, when we're getting ready to do a release, it's an all-hands effort. Everybody helps to test, and you know, if we go directly through, so we got this big checklist, and each item on the checklist is a big automation thing that might run for 6 or 8 hours a piece. And some of them are pretty quick, but some of them will run a long time like that. And it takes 2 days to go straight through the checklist if there are no problems. But typically it will take a couple of weeks to get through the checklist, because we'll get most of the way through and there'll be some subtle bug where it's not working on OpenBSD if you compile with certain command line options, and then we'll have to fix that, and then we start over. So it'll typically take a week or two.
You have in your automation all these platforms set up? I mean, is it?
Well, I've got 30 minutes, 30 seconds. A note to the producers, that sign is way too small for 52-year-old eyes to see, okay? I have no idea how much time I have left, but this will be the last question, I presume. And the question was,
You have all these platforms?
I have all these platforms. Yeah, well, we've all got Windows, Mac, and Linux, obviously. And I've got an account, we've got a Spark station, we've got Android platform, and then we've got an account. Somebody gave us an account on an OpenBSD machine somewhere, and we use that. And then we've got virtual boxes for 2 or 3 others. But most of our testing happens on Linux and Windows and Mac. That's where the bulk of it does. And if it works on those 3, it's probably also going to work on, I do testing on a Mac iBook PowerPC, because it's a 32-bit big Indian platform. Where else do you find one of those? I mean, and so if you test on those 5, I mean, you've got pretty much all of your bases covered. Okay, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you all for being here. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Your customers rely on your website or application. If it's slow or non-responsive, it infuriates your users and costs you money. Keeping your business-critical systems humming along requires insight into what they're doing. Your system metrics tell stories that can reveal performance bottlenecks, resource limitations, and other problems. But how do you keep an eye on all of your system's performance metrics in real time and record this data for later analysis? Enter Longview, the new way to see what's really going on under the hood. The Longview dashboard lets you visualize the status of all your systems, providing you with a bird's-eye view of your entire fleet. You can sort by CPU, memory, swap, processes load, and network usage. Click a specific system to access its individual dashboard, then click and drag to zoom in on choke points and get more detail. Comprehensive network data, including inbound and outbound traffic, is available on the Network tab, and disk writes and free space on the Disks tab, while the Process Explorer displays usage statistics for individual processes. The System Info tab shows listening services, active connections, and available updates. Adding Longview to a system is easy. Just click the button, copy the one-line installation command, then run the command on your Linux system to complete the process. The agent will begin collecting data and sending it to Longview. Then the graphs start rolling. Use Longview to gain visibility into your servers, so when your website or app heats up, it stays up.
When we created Asterisk over a decade ago, we could not have imagined that Asterisk would not only become the most widely adopted open source communication software on the planet, but that it would impact the entire industry in the way that it has. Today, Asterisk has found its way into more than 170 countries and virtually every Fortune 1000 company.
The success of Asterisk has enabled a transition of power from the hands of the traditional proprietary phone vendors into the hands of the users and administrators of phone systems. Using this power, our customers have created all sorts of business-changing applications, from small office phone systems to mission-critical call centers to international carrier networks. In fact, there's even an entire country whose communications infrastructure runs on Asterisk.
Digium has always been about creating technology that expands communications capabilities in ways that we could never have imagined. And that's part of what's game-changing about Digium. Today, we're doing it again, this time by introducing a new family of HDIP phones that extends control of the user all the way to the desktop.
The launch of these new products represents the next phase in Digium's history of innovation. These are the first and only IP phones designed to fully leverage the power of Asterisk. When we first discussed our expectations for building a family of phones for use with Asterisk, our requirements were pretty simple. We asked the team to build the phones such that they were easy to install, integrate, provision, and use. I think you'll soon agree our engineers have delivered on that goal. User feedback is validating that when it comes to operation with Asterisk-based systems, including our own SwitchVox-based product, these are the easiest to use, best integrated, most interoperable products on the market today. The Digium family of phones will initially include 3 IP desk phones, uniquely designed to complement any Asterisk or SwitchVox-based solution. These phones are different for a number of reasons. First, they're exclusively designed for use with Asterisk. Secondly, we've made it really easy to auto-discover and provision the phones. Next, we've made it easy for the phones to access information inside of Asterisk, allowing tight coupling between an application and the phone. Additionally, we've created an applications engine that allows users and developers to create and run their own apps on the phone. And finally, we've done all of this at a very compelling price point. At Digium, we're always thinking of ways to give our customers the best value in business phone systems and also give them the power to create their own solutions for any communications challenge.
We'll continue to push the boundaries, not only to make Asterisk cooler, faster, and more technologically feature-rich, but to make Asterisk and VoIP communications even easier.
And together, we'll change the way the world communicates.
Again.
Cloud stacks are everywhere.
This is the way to better utilize all your resources, and it makes managing all your resources pretty easy.
All of the innovation is happening in open source.
The collaborative nature and of the community and the speed at which these deficiencies, these bugs are getting discovered and then fixed is a thing that really shows the power of the open source community.
It is global, and it's definitely because of the users.
Community people are extremely friendly and always ready to help.
If you go onto IRC any day, you'll see these guys helping each other out, and they're all doing it like in a selfless manner.
The product is transparent for everyone. Everyone can look at the code base. Everyone can see how CloudStack is being built. Nothing is proprietary. Everything is open.
In many ways, it's absolutely vital to the ongoing health of CloudStack.
The most exciting event in recent memory for me was our first developer boot camp. And our call gave people, I think, maybe 2 weeks notice to come attend. I was expecting 25 or 30 people. So we ended up with 87 people and had to go get more chairs into the room twice.
Everything within cloud computing is commodity and is open source. And so I don't think that you'll see anywhere where open source is not pervasive in cloud computing. And so I think it's an assumption. I think when you talk about cloud computing, you're really talking about open source cloud computing.
CloudStack is a robust solution for large deployments.
You have dozens of data centers and thousands of servers in each data center. Hardware is going to fail, and CloudStack is designed to handle, number one, that mass scale. Number two, it's designed to handle the failure that inevitably happens in large deployments.
started working on CloudStack over 4 years ago, and it was the original set of people working on it had a background of delivering software to telcos and service providers.
Lots of QA, lots of users actually using it.
High availability is the key feature. Multiple hypervisor support, different network models. You can pick up whatever suits you better.
CloudStack management server can be deployed in different physical machines.
It definitely has a huge footprint. It's being deployed everywhere.
There's a major movie studio that they were using CloudStack. They were using it to transcode video, and I thought that was terribly fascinating. What I found more fascinating is what they did during lunch, where they would spin up 50 or 60 game servers. Then as soon as lunch was over, they would destroy all the instances and go back to doing real work.
CloudStack is vast. It touches so many different aspects, and there's no one person that's kind of like a master of all those realms.
I think CloudStack as a project is going to be one of the leaders, simply because it's some of the most featureful and robust platforms out there.
I don't see any limits to the CloudStack.
Most enterprises today realize that usernames and passwords alone aren't enough to keep their network safe from unauthorized intrusions. That's why two-factor authentication has gotten so popular lately. It adds that extra layer of protection enterprise networks need to stay safe. But what you may not know is that some two-factor authentication solutions, they're better than others, like two-factor strong authentication with Wicked. Wicked goes beyond other authentication systems by being less expensive, easier to implement, and easier to use, giving you software-based token clients built to run on all major devices and OSs, including iOS and Android. These tokens utilize a public-private key combination that's generated on device, so there aren't any shared secrets flying around for attackers to hijack, or which require any special handling. Instead, all keys are kept secure and private between the requesting token and your server, which you control in-house, making it the most secure way possible to perform authentication encryption. And with an extensive, flexible API and support for protocols like LDAP and Radius, Wicked works with any enterprise network architecture to protect the IT systems vital to your enterprise. Download your Wicked free trial today, regardless of whether you're considering two-factor authentication for the first time or just ready to ditch your existing expensive key fob system. We can help with easy-to-implement, easy-to-use, strong authentication from Wicked.